Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have quorum, and it is the hour. And I'll look to any members of committee for disclosures of pecuniary interest. Councillor Helmer.
There's a report about pay equity, and there are references to various bargaining groups. And if we do get into discussion around SEIU, which, as I've declared in the past, has been a client of my company, I'll have to absent myself from those discussions. The report itself on pay equity, I don't have a conflict.
Thank you, Councillor. Appreciate that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we do have Mr. Stewart, our integrity commissioner, here with us. It's a timed item for 12:30. I'm going to go directly to that at this time. I've asked Mr. Stewart to give a brief presentation, and as per the motion at our last meeting, we also asked him to come and talk to us about his work plan for the upcoming year. This is his annual report, and so the motion was to answer questions and discuss future work of the Integrity Commissioner on such matters as education and a review of the Code of Conduct and the euphemistic catch-all, etc. So, Mr. Stewart, if you wouldn't mind coming forward, welcome, sir. And the mic works on a button system, and just for your reference, only you or one other person can have a mic at the same time. It's quite a handy system, actually. So I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to come in and to speak with you. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. I'm maybe the guy you don't like to see walk into the room sometimes, so it's a unique opportunity to come and speak with you. As you're aware, in the late spring or early summer, I basically completed a first year as the Integrity Commissioner for the City of London. And in accordance with that, I prepared and forwarded an annual report, which was delivered to the clerk's office, and as I understand it, distributed to council and then subsequently to this committee. And I can make a few comments on that report, maybe give you an idea of how I arrived at things, how I tried to deal with things. The first part of the report is basically background, just talking about my position, the term of my position, and generally what, under the agreement with the city, I am to do as the Integrity Commissioner. There's an advisory role, which is to advise councillors on issues very often relating to conflict of interest, but other issues regarding policy, et cetera, if they so choose. There's a compliance and investigation and an inquiry function, which is probably the most, probably the center of what I would be doing, and hopefully the part that you don't have to do as often, but the part that involves the most time and the most attention when it has to be done. There's a reporting function to council, and there's an educational element of what I do. During the year, what I have done is I've outlined, because a lot of what I do under the code and under the act has to be confidential. And so what I have done in the report, and I have done it on the basis that it is what I have seen a lot of other integrity commissioners reporting in this fashion, is to give you a flavor of the activity without necessarily going into the actual details, because particularly if it's a request made by a councillor to me with regard to conflict of interest or another issue, I consider that to be confidential between myself and the councillor. What the councillor does with it is up to the councillor, but it's not my job to start telling people that Councillor so-and-so called me on such and such a date and asked me these questions, and this is what I said. So the report itself gives you some kind of an indication of the activity. I did not receive any specific requests for educational issues I did receive, within some of the discussions with the counselors, questions about, very often surrounding conflict of interest or how it operated or that type of thing. So in that context, there were some educational elements to it. But as I said, with the advent of the new amendments to the Municipal Act, the educational function may be greater this year than it would be in a lot of years, or this year or next year. And I'll direct my comments to that more completely in a minute. As far as advice requests, during the period of the report, I received 18 requests from members of council. Most of them concerned questions of potential conflict of interest. And they were direct, usually setting out a scenario with regard to a specific issue, and do I have a conflict in this case? And in discussion with the counselor, I tried to work through that and give them some advice as to whether they had a conflict, and secondly, what they should do in regard to that conflict. So I had 18 of those. And in those cases, in some of the cases, the advice given was verbal. In some of the cases, there was a written follow-up at the request of the counselor. Now, that element will change with the new act, because those things are now, will have to be in writing. And it's probably the best way to handle it in any event. I did receive email and telephone contact from members of the public about the code in general, and I would try to provide general information as to how to access the code and the process. And in doing so, I pointed out I did not assist individuals in filing complaints. And the reason that statement is in there is because my position has to be impartial. And I cannot be in a position where I assist the counselor in dealing with a complaint, and I cannot be in a situation where I assist the complainant, other than outlining the process to either side if they ask me. So that statement is in there for that purpose, so that I don't have follow-up questions. Well, did people call you and you filled out the complaint for them, or you did this type of thing? I may have, in some instances, written back and said, well, I understand what you're getting at, but I haven't got enough information. Would you provide me with more information? Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. As far as complaints were concerned during the period, I received 14 complaints asking for investigations. Of them, I dismissed, and that's the phrase, it sounds kind of harsh, but it just means that I'm not going to pursue it. 12 of them without an investigation, meaning without a full investigation. There's a vetting that goes on, and it's in the code of conduct, where I look at the complaint, I look at the nature of it, I look at the jurisdiction, what jurisdiction I have, and whether it should go on to the next stage. And there were 12 of them where I felt it wasn't warranted. There were 2 that I indicate in there that I did conduct an investigation. One involved a report to council, as you're aware. The other, according to the terms of the code, I investigated, found that there wasn't a contravention, and in accordance with the direction in the code, chose not to submit a report, although I did submit a comment to both the complainant and the counselor involved. So they had some understanding as to how I arrived at the decision I arrived at. The one comment that I should clarify is that there were some of in the cases of those that I did not pursue, they fell into 2 categories. Some I did not pursue because they didn't fall under my jurisdiction or what I was supposed to do. Some I dismissed because I felt there were political motivations behind them. Now, by political motivations, what I'm referring to is I received requests, and this sort of bridges both of them. I'll give you a generic example. I did receive requests for investigation in cases where basically what I was being asked to do by the complainant was to intervene into a debate in council or into a vote in council. I received complaints that would say, and I'm making this up, so I'm not betraying any confidences, that would say, this issue is coming before council tonight, you're the integrity commissioner, you have to stop them. You can't do this. In other words, those types of things. And I consider those to, in the broad sense, have political motivation, and they're certainly not something that I'm charged to do, nor do I want to be, quite frankly. The others were cases where there was a misunderstanding as to jurisdiction, and I get a variety of issues. I've had people call me because their streets weren't being swept, or because their garbage wasn't being picked up. And obviously, that's not something that I deal with. And in every case, I would respond and explain I don't have jurisdiction and why. And those were the types of other complaints that were not pursued. And that's basically the report. I think that's about all I can say about it at this point. If you certainly any questions, do you want to go into that first and then go into the other element? Or?
I think it might be prudent to have questions on the past, and then Mr. Stewart has a presentation on sort of the future.
Right.
So if it, I turn to my colleagues, if you'd like to ask questions on the report, we've now had a chance to look at it twice and to have Mr. Stewart walk through it. And then he'll shift gears and present what he would be proposing on a go-forward basis. Councillor Morgan.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. First off, let me say thank you for coming. I think there's great value in having you here before us to talk about the report and the details in it. I know that obviously the report does generate some public interest in itself. And I appreciated that you clarified the types of dismissals and the differences of them about out of jurisdiction and politically motivated and what that actually means, because I think that that's some of the questions that was being speculated about. What does these 12 things mean? Why are they just being dismissed and not investigated? And I think you clarified today that indeed that doesn't mean that they were just dismissed. I mean, the out of jurisdiction items you may have provided some information to, but the politically motivated ones, you did do your initial look at it, make a determination. And given that, and on the report, I thought this is the first time we've had a report from you, and I'm wondering if my colleagues have any suggestions and if it's appropriate for the chair about if this is the type of information and the formatting of the report that we want. I think there would have been some value in a little more detail in that section just to avoid some of the public comments. Your comments today, I think, clarified it for anybody listening very well, and maybe that's something that would be valuable in the future, not to the level where you're saying, here's the specific complaint and here's the people, but the general breakdown of what it means to dismiss when there are dismissals, so it doesn't look like, there's 14 complaints and 12 of them are just being thrown out, which is not the case. So I found value in the presentation today in enhancing the report. I think maybe there's some thoughts on ways we can have, more detail in that section of the report in the future, so that it's very clear for the public. Although it's a report to us, I think that there's general interest in this stuff because it is a publicly accessible process on the complaint side as well.
Councillor Usher, and then over to Councillor Squire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the report. Glad to see your presence here today. It's very helpful. The biggest question that I get was, how do I, from the public, who may want to reach you, they want me to tell them how to reach you. I generally refer them to the city clerk's office. And I'm assuming that the city clerk's office would be the appropriate place. But do you have any other suggestions as to how the public would be able to reach you other than through the city clerk office if they want to reach you?
There is, I'll get on to it before. There is, within the City of London website, there is a page dealing with the Office of the Integrity Commissioner, generally somewhat biographical, but on the bottom gives all of the contact information. I would assume that's how people would do it. If there is an issue and I'm glad to hear that, if there is indeed an issue where there is difficulty or the public isn't sure about how to access my services or access me, I will certainly look into seeing if there are other means we can do it. I had not received any complaints about difficulty in accessing it, but it could be because the person who was complaining couldn't access me. And in other cases, I found people have no trouble finding me, so. But if that isn't working, I had a discussion with the clerk's office when I was first appointed, and they very kindly agreed to have your web people or whoever do it set up a page within the context of the City of London website. And if you go on that website, there is, I think on the first page, actually, there's an icon there for the Integrity Commission. You click that and the page comes up.
Just for information, the clerk just pulled up the page. On the page, it has the role of the Integrity Commissioner, a little bit of biography about Mr. Stewart, his email address, his phone number, and a toll-free number. And then there's a PDF of the complaint protocol and the code of conduct for members as well on it. I guess the only addition just off the top would be something that says integritycommissioner@london.ca that then goes, it would just be forwarded. The IT people who set it up actually are, where are they? They're sitting over here, so anything we want, today's the day to get it done, so. Councillor, anything further? You still have the floor.
Thank you for that. And I do know that it was there, but somehow some of the people had difficulty because they saw a website, but they didn't see the individual and they didn't know how it would get there. One of the questions that I get a lot from the public with respect to the Integrity Commissioner is to do with conflict of interest. And I generally refer them to you. I don't know how many of you mentioned that you get some of these, and what I'm concerned about is not the ones that the council is asking about, but the ones that the public have asked you about. Have you received, through you, Mr. Chair, many requests for understanding of conflict of interest? For example, when we did our compensation task force, people asked us if we were all in, that's just one, all in conflict. The other one is absence from meetings, and the other one is employment with the city while we're on council and so on. So I'm just wondering how you handle these and whether you got these from the public, because the public comes to me with these, so.
Well, the actual conflict of interest elements of it, I can't say that I've had a huge amount of contact from the public about that. I have had a couple of instances where the request came in such a manner as they were asking my advice as to whether a specific councillor had a conflict. And I have turned those away, indicating that I'm not here to advise the public on whether a specific councillor has a conflict. And at that time, this is going to change shortly. I really had no jurisdiction to investigate a conflict. The code of conduct currently says, and I've had a couple of instances where I've had to proceed in this fashion, says something to the effect that if it has to do with a conflict of interest, we're to refer them out to their own lawyer, because at that time, the investigative process or the judicial, in a very broad sense, process was to make an application to a Superior Court of Justice. We'll talk more about this in the work plan, but with the amendments in the Act, integrity commissioners are being charged with a broader jurisdiction in dealing with conflict of interest and investigating it. So that could change the element somewhat. If a member of the public contacted me and asked me generally about conflict of interest, I would certainly answer their question. And that's fair game. I've not had anyone do that. But if they did, I would answer it. But if they contact me, and I said I've had a couple of instances where basically I was more or less being asked, is this councillor in a conflict? And that's not my job to answer that question, or it isn't under the current legislation, and I don't think is appropriate. That may change as time goes, but with the new legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I'll look to Councillor Squire.
Thank you very much for coming, and I appreciate that and the opportunity to be here. I can tell you I've had no complaints about the Integrity Commissioner from the public as of yet, which is great. The one question I wanted to ask you is, you indicated there were 12 dismissals. I just wonder if you provide the public member who's contacting you, do you provide them a reason why it was dismissed? In other words, do you say, look, I'm dismissing this because it's within the political sphere and not within my jurisdiction, so that they have a fulsome idea of, or concept as to why you didn't adjudicate on it?
Yes, characteristically in those instances, what I will do, and it's fairly brief, but I will respond to them either by letter or by email and just indicate that, acknowledge receiving it, that I have considered it, and that it does not fall within my jurisdiction. My jurisdiction is this doesn't fall in that jurisdiction, or it is, I may not have used the word political necessarily, but that it is an issue before council, and what you're basically asking me to do is intervene in that issue, and that's not part of what I do or am supposed to do.
Okay, thank you. Any other? Yeah, Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. First, I agree with Councillor Morgan that perhaps the report is a good opportunity to give a little bit more of a sense of why things might be dismissed in general terms, and I think that's just a helpful piece of feedback. And yeah, I also appreciate that the report is quite concise. You know, go on and on, which is great. My question is around, generally speaking, and just a rough estimate would be fine, how much time it's taken to do this kind of work on behalf of the residents of the City of London.
Well, as far as the concise part goes, people aren't used to lawyers being concise, I guess. But
There's several in the room
I
pleading
know
guilty.
I know
so.
a couple of them. Couple of them have seen me. Couple of them have seen me in action and could probably comment on how concise I normally am. But as far as amounts of time, it depends on the issue. Like some of them I can deal with relatively quickly. Some of them are obviously not in my jurisdiction. Like, as I said, one that's basically, if it's asking me to intervene in something that's before council, that may take 20 minutes. Some of them take longer. Vetting something and making a decision as to whether it falls under, well, first of all, does it fall under my jurisdiction? And secondly, is it something that should trigger an investigation under the Code of Conduct? Can take anywhere from an hour to a couple of hours or longer. It depends on the nature of the complaint, and it depends on how much information is provided. For example, if the individual wants me to look at streaming of committee meetings or council meetings or things like that, that obviously is going to take longer. A full-blown investigation can take a significant number of hours. Now, it's spread out. I don't sit down and just do nothing but that for a month or something like that. But it can take several hours because and more, because it involves whatever degree of investigation is necessary. It involves then, once that's been done, sitting down, sifting through it, and then writing the report can take a while, because that really is probably the most critical part of it, because that's the part that, that's going to impact the councillor. It's the part the public may, well, depending on the nature of it, whether the public may or may not see, but so it can take hours, days sometimes.
Okay. Why don't we just pivot at this time? Okay, I'd like to get to his work plan.
That's great. I have another question, though. And through the chair, one other thing you touched on in your presentation that I thought was valuable was the distinction between verbal advice and written advice. And I think I've been the beneficiary of both, and I appreciate your advice very much. Given that you talked about it changing in your presentation under the new act, do you think that we should move in future to a more formal process now, rather than wait for the act? In other words, should we start doing either by, policy or practice, a more formal back and forth to prepare ourselves for the new regime?
It isn't a bad idea. I mean, there's a point at which you're going to have to do it. There are practicalities of it. And I think, many of you have run into it. The more formal it is, it takes on a life of its own, because if I get a phone call and say, this is the situation, do I have a conflict? That's something between myself and the counselor. If it's in writing, you always have to wonder, well, if this hits the light of day, it has to be couched in a certain way, it has to be worded a certain way, and as does my response, so it would take longer. The one element of it that would become a little more cumbersome would be the circumstances where a counselor calls me on the day of a council meeting, and it happens, and I understand that. I've been a counselor, I understand that you get the agenda probably before the weekend, you read the agenda over the weekend, and all of a sudden something jumps up at you, I got a potential conflict. And if you get a call, say at 9 o'clock on the morning of the council meeting, and I can't get back to you till noon, and you have to put it in writing and you have to send it to me and all this, it may eliminate that. Now, it does say, and we have to wait and see what kind of regulations they come out with this and how it sifts out, but it can also possibly mean that even though advice is given verbally, that there has to be a formal written request and it has to be followed up with a written answer, which I think has been the practice up until now, is generally, I will speak to the counselor. There has to be some discussion. You're not going to do it in an exchange of letters. I think it's more that the province is concerned that there be some documentation of these things. And I think, just if I can just go one step further, I think one of the reasons they may be doing that, and I've been asked this question before, is integrity commissioners are going to be in an odd situation where they're going to give advice to a counselor on a conflict issue, and then they may be asked to investigate it afterwards. So I think probably the province wants more of a written record for that reason. And the question becomes, how do you handle that? It probably have to be referred out to another integrity commissioner, but we still have to play that out.
I appreciate that response, and I do believe there is a balance between, the need for speed, for lack of a better term, and the need to be formal. I've thought about potentially contemplating the scenario where I may need to call you during a meeting, depending on the way the debate goes. And so I think there's a balance there, and I think in the course when we talk about, and I won't jump to the education part yet, but I think that there's probably a role to play and a discussion to have, maybe through the education lens of your job, on how we're going to navigate this, both from in informing ourselves and having the right policy, as well as ensuring that we're respectful of the legislation while still being, relatively nimble to get the advice that we need in a timely fashion. So I appreciate the answers.
Okay, just one follow-up to that. Any written advice you would give would be subject to MFIPA, is that correct? That's a yes.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, the public isn't storming the Bastille and coming in today, but they often are watching online and streaming, so that's why we need to get.
As I said, they're still working on regulations on this thing, and that may be impacted by that, I don't know.
Okay, could we turn to your work plan, sir? And could you walk us through that, and then we'll turn to the committee for comments and questions.
Yes, I've prepared, it's a very brief work plan just to sort of sketch something out which will need to be further fleshed out as we go along. But the first thing I've addressed is the question of review of the code of conduct. And obviously with the legislative changes coming in, there's going to have to be a review of elements of it, particularly because the code of conduct is basically doesn't have much at all on conflict of interest other than saying you refer the member of the public out to someone. So I think, first of all, there has to be a review to incorporate these new items that are outlined in the legislation. And the legislation is relatively specific with regard to elements of how you deal with municipal conflict of interest. Those amendments are coming into effect on March 1st, the ones that affect the Integrity Commissioner. There are others that are coming in January that don't impact this. The major areas, just to characterize them, are dealing with requests from members of council and local boards for advice from Integrity Commissioners concerning their obligations under the code, under procedures, rules, or policies of the municipality, or under the Conflict of Interest Act, are now to be made in writing, and advice is to be given in writing, which we just talked about. There are provisions of the Act concerning restrictions on requesting and pursuing investigations in relation to municipal elections. Now, there were before, but they fleshed those out considerably about basically generically, without going into a lot of detail, from the nomination date when the election period starts until after the election, there's not a lot that can be done by an Integrity Commissioner. We're sort of just, we can't do anything in that period, other than give advice. We can give advice on conflict of interest, but we can't do anything investigative. There are new provisions allowing persons to apply to Integrity Commissioners for an investigation regarding alleged contraventions, and that's a big factor, which, again, the Code of Conduct should be reviewed to make sure that that process is clearly outlined as to how that should be done. There's also an expanded meaning of conflict of interest in the Act, in that it refers to the normal conflict that we've dealt with, which is it's still pecuniary, it's still financial. The normal one, where if you have a direct or indirect financial interest, you can't participate before, during, or after, or try to influence the decision. But there's also a section 5.2 which talks about using the influence of your office when you have a pecuniary interest, which doesn't involve necessarily voting or debating, but can involve your dealings with constituents, where you may have some financial relation to them. And you know, we'll have to see how this sort of fleshes out as it goes along, but it can, you know, possibly go all the way to the question of, if you have some business relationship with someone, do you introduce them to someone in town hall, in city hall? It could go that far. We'll have to see how it works out. One of the things I'm also recommending, and this goes somewhat to what Councillor Usher was getting at, the Code of Conduct you have now sort of gives a description of how people should go about filing a complaint. I'm going to recommend that when we do amendments to the Code of Conduct, that we develop an appendix which is solely devoted to that, which says, member of the public, if you want to make a complaint under the Code of Conduct or a request, this is what you do, point. So they can almost check it off. And I think it may make it easier for the public. It'll probably make it easier for the members of council. And it'll certainly make it, the process a little more streamlined. And I'm going to make that recommendation. And I would like to look at streamlining, and I don't have anything specific to recommend you at this point, but there are different references in the Code of Conduct to when I report to council and when I don't. Like if I do an investigation, I report to council if I find there was a violation. If I do an investigation and I don't find there was a violation, it says that except in extraordinary circumstances, I don't report to council. So I'd like to take a look at that just to make sure that it's comprehensive and that it's transparent for the public. It doesn't look like I'm sitting there and saying, oh, you know, I'm not going to do this because somebody's going to get upset with it or something like that, where it's clear when I report and when I don't, because there's this broad discretionary area there that may not be appropriate. As far as the process is concerned, and there will be other tinkering that should be done, and we can go through that. What I'm going to suggest is that council direct me to prepare a draft proposal of an amended code. In other words, to take your code, to recommend the changes I think should be made and to send it to council for review and discussion. And then, based on that review and discussion, prepare an amended code that you could then consider, vote on, and adopt. The education element of it, I've been rather general. As far as a lot of it will have to do with the new conflict, with the new amendments, because that's a big area, and that's a critical area for counselors. I mean, it's a very difficult area. And I think that, once we get down to refining the code and putting those in, I think it would warrant some type of educational process to talk about that, and what does it mean, and how are we going to use it, and this type of thing. I imagine AMO and some of the organizations you're involved in may well be producing some material on that. They may not. I could provide it as part of an in-person presentation. In other words, I could meet with council and go in an education session and go through it. And the appropriate time would be maybe when we're developing it, or maybe when it's about to be adopted, to talk about, okay, now how are we going to use this? And that's good for you, and I think it's good for the public too, to see that. And, or it could be provided through written commentary also, but I think in some respects there should be an in-person meeting. I think one of the things you might want to consider, and I've done this for years, as you know, I act for a number of municipalities in the Huron and Perth area as their council. And one of the things that a number of them have me do is, after an election, many times they have an orientation day, and they have different departments come in and talk about, this is what we do, this is what we do, this is what we do, which is a refresher for the sitting councilors and is helpful for the new ones. You may want to include me, if you do that, to just do a section on the code of conduct and how it operates and what the obligations are, and specifically on the conflict of interest element. I think that may be a good idea. As far as the timing, I mean, I can start looking at that now. You may want to wait until after the new year to start seriously looking at discussing and adopting, because my understanding is the ministry is still going through developing regulations, and there may be regulations that could have some impact on it. But certainly sometime in the very near future, we should start looking at that. So that's sort of a general idea of what I think we should be doing. I would also, certainly, if we're going through this process, I would be hopeful to get some input from councilors too, as to, areas that they find cumbersome or that aren't clear to them, or those types of things, because that's the time to refine those things.
Okay, so that's really helpful, and thank you for that. I think there's some suggestions there, some of which we can craft into a motion when we're finished our questions and comments here. I would say one comment, I think a revised code of conduct should come back to SPPC. I think it's something that council as a whole should probably wrap its mind around. And I think that's probably the place, although it's the purview of this committee. I think at that juncture, it's really all of council. And I think that would be the place for that to come back. I think there's some very helpful things here, both in terms of the reporting and in terms of keeping us up to speed for the changes that are coming. So I'll turn to members of committee. I think I've got Councillor Usher, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Chair, and thank you for the work plan report, sir. I think that on the processes where the recommendations that he came up with is very appropriate, and I fully agree with you that SPPC might be a better place than here, even though this is the appropriate committee. If we don't do it at SPPC, then at least if we do it at SPPC, we'll have most of the members present. I want to ask two questions, and I'm going backwards with this one because I'm going down the timing first. When you say early in the new year, are you talking 2019 or 2018? Because you said that this, sorry? 2018. Okay. Okay. The reason I asked the question is because of the election, and then a new council comes in at the end of 2018. And I thought that that's what you were referring to, especially since you said that the Municipal Act will come into effect March of 2019. So I just wanted to get that clear. If you mean 2018, that's fine. I want to go back to the statement that you made with respect to expanded meaning of conflict of interest, because I think that that's a very important statement that you made there, and the things that you said are very appropriate. We each probably handle this differently, and I have seen different people come up with different acceptance that they have a conflict in this and that. And for me, in some cases, I would not declare it conflict. It's up to that councilor's prerogative, but so I don't criticize it. But since you brought this up, and you mentioned financial implication as one, and business, and I'm assuming that in terms of business, it could be friendship also. So here's my dilemma, and why I'm asking the question. You take something like, for example...
Counselor, could you get to the question, please?
That's what I'm getting to. I just
quickly.
said that.
Yeah.
Here's my dilemma. In the case of BRT, for example, BRT goes two routes. It goes on some main streets. And then some of us may live on some side streets. And if we live too close to that, we may say it's a conflict. Or if there's a repair of a street near us, we may say it's a conflict. And I'm a little puzzled about why is it that we would declare that at times. Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's a little difficult in the abstract to comment on it. I mean, the Act defines what a pecuniary interest is, and it's a financial interest. So generally, and I'm not talking, the comments I'm making aren't related to BRT or any particular thing. It's a question of whether or not objectively, and the law has termed it this way, objectively, the counselor's financial interest, and that can be positive or negative, in an issue is significant enough that it might, in fact, or might be seen to influence their vote. And in some ways, that's a personal decision. Some are clear. If I own a construction business and I have a tender before council and I sit on council, then I've got a conflict. Or if my son does, or my wife does, or I think it goes to parents too, then I have a conflict. Those are clear. There are others that are less clear. Each counselor has to make that decision. There are cases where courts have found that there may be technically a conflict, but it isn't significant enough that it would have influenced the counselor's vote. I mean, you have to use those as what you use to judge it. You have to look at how the courts have dealt with it and how it's been dealt with other than that. But bottom line, I've always operated from this point of view, and I did it when I was a counselor, and I had to make these decisions myself. If I have to ask myself the question, then I have to look at it pretty carefully, because it's the old thing where there's smoke, there's fire. There's a perception issue very often. People may perceive you have a conflict when you don't. You may never convince them you don't. But if you have to ask yourself the question, then you have to delve into it. And the question of whether you do or not, as I said, sometimes is very clear, sometimes is not so clear. I'm trying to think of an example where it wouldn't be quite clear. Sometimes it gets carried away. I go to a restaurant every morning to pick up a cup of coffee, and something council's going to do is going to influence that restaurant. I don't have a pecuniary interest there unless I own the restaurant. But others, if I own the restaurant, that's a different story. So it's almost case specific but those are kind of the parameters you have to look at.
Okay? Okay, I'm sorry, Councillor Park.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. And these comments aren't for the Integrity Commissioner. I've listened to the answers and I think they've been quite good. But I think that there's merit in going forward with the appendix that he was discussing in terms of making sure there's a good path for folks to follow. And I don't know if we need a motion to do that, to have the website updated or not, but I think it's a good way to move forward considering the concerns that Councillor Usher brought forward with people not knowing necessarily how to move forward. And I don't see that as anything that has to be hindered by a timeline going forward with the updates to the code of conduct and that sort of thing.
I'll look to the clerk in terms of how easy it would be to put together that kind of a appendix in consultation with Mr. Stewart. We have similar protocols, you know, for other human resource types complaints that we might be able to be similar in terms of the process. We're just waiting. There's a consultation happening between legal and clerk in the background.
Thank you. The city does have a complaint protocol, and I believe the Integrity Commissioner has referred to that in his answers to you. So you could look at preparing a summary of that complaint protocol process, which I believe is what the appendix idea is, and that could be posted on the web. Or you could look at producing an appendix as well that could be attached to the protocol, which would be an amendment. There's a number of ways to do it, and we'd be happy to look at that with the Integrity Commissioner if you want to direct the Integrity Commissioner accordingly.
Madam Clerk?
And through Mr. Chair, the complaint protocol is already on the website. So as Ms. Snout said, we could take it and maybe perhaps do a summary with a checklist that we could also post on the website if that's of any assistance.
You know, just a comment. When someone in the public hears protocol, they may not know that that's actually the process. We talk about plain language, and this is how to make a complaint. It may make it a little clearer. Councillor Park.
Thank you. I just recognized that Mr. Daly's here, so I wanted him to hear. Perhaps we could have a link to the complaint protocol on the existing Integrity Commissioner page. I just gave it a quick glance and there's no such link there.
It's buried in the PDF.
Yeah, link. Links are so easy.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we will make it so. Mr. Daly and I will work together to work on plain language and work on links.
So we have it. We had the soft copy version, which was Mr. Daly nodding yes, and the hard copy from the clerk will get it done. Thank you. Other questions? Councillor Helmer? Councillor, the clerk has prepared a motion. I think I'd like to see this back, and I threw out the date by, I'm not sure if it's in there. Is it? By the end of January, because if something's coming in force and effect in the beginning of March, it would be good to have a little bit of heads up, particularly if there's any tweaking that needs to happen between it coming into force and effect. I would be prepared to move more expeditiously, but we don't have the regulations, and I think sometimes we end up chasing rabbit tails if we don't have those regulations. So I think we can keep moving in this direction and get the detail, but certainly by the end of January would be a good time. Any other comments or to Councillor Usher, and then I'll be looking for a mover and seconder.
Just to you, Mr. Chair, you mentioned something about the end of March just now, about being expeditiously. I'm not so sure what you're referring to about the end of March, because here we talk about the Municipal Act for...
Let me help you. The new regulations are supposed to come in according to the second bullet point of the work plan March 1st. Of 2019. So, okay, I'm 1 year ahead. So it depends on when we get those regulations, I guess. So, sorry, I'm faster than, I was thinking we're a year ahead, so. Mr. Stewart, do we think we'll have regulations by the first quarter of 18?
Working on them now, so I'm assuming they'll start flowing shortly.
What's the will of committee? I'm sorry, it was my bad. I was a year ahead of myself.
I don't have the background document, but that 2019 may be a typo. I think it's maybe two.
We have a mic.
Oh,
that's
there we
on.
go, finally. No, Councillor Helmer, with his handy laptop here, looked it up, and it was 2019 was the correct date. There are some provisions of legislation that come into effect next year, but most of the stuff the Integrity Commissioner is talking about is indeed March of 2019. I think that's the effect date. What will matter is the regulations, and once you know the parameters under which we have to operate, certainly we can move in the direction that has been discussed. We don't have to wait for it to be in effect. Quite frankly, we would want to do it before it was in effect. So I think leaving it a little more broad, although I really usually don't like to do that, because we can certainly always check in at this committee on that. Because what we don't want to do is bind a time frame, and then the regulations aren't out until the second week of January, and that's just not reasonable. So I think in this case,
backed
broad
that
is
out.
probably
We backed
better.
that out, and that was my misread on it. So, so we've backed the January date out to the extent that they're known. We'll move as quickly as we can in terms of it making sense, in terms of what we have available to us. Does that make sense? Take a look at what's on the screen now.
You want me to pull out this?
Yeah. We'll take out by the end of January, and we'll just move as quickly as we can.
I would give my own thoughts on the presentation, and where I would hesitate on part of the direction we're moving is, should the regulations take longer than we anticipate? I believe there's great merit in a number of components of the work plan and moving forward as soon as possible, particularly on developing some of the education components, the streamlining of updates and reporting to council, some of the other components of this. Certainly if the regulations are going to be delayed, and we experienced that with other regulations that we were waiting for, it took very long, gave us very short timelines. I think it would be ideal for the Integrity Commissioner to work on the things that he can work on with the broad-based parameter of direction that we've given him, and still feel very comfortable to adjust the work plan to come back and say, we're ready to talk about some of these components, even though the regulations may not be ready, and we might do it in a two-phased approach. Because I liked what our Integrity Commissioner had to say about the level of transparency for the public, to see us working through this and to have the dialogues and the back and forth like we're having today on the reporting and the structure and the types of questions that we know are floating out there and finding answers to them. I think there's value in that. So even if there's an expected check-in point that we would plan for, where some of this work could be done, and if the regulations aren't ready, then at that point we just say, well, this information is coming. I think that would be ideal, and if this motion allows for that, and our Integrity Commissioner sees that as allowing for that, I think that would be valuable. I don't want to handcuff him with the wording of a motion. If he feels there are things that he can come back with sooner that we can work on together, then I would prefer to proceed as soon as possible.
Perhaps if I could be helpful, maybe we should be looking at an education session around these issues sometime in the first quarter of 2018. I'm sure even as we go into the election year, there may be members of the public that might be considering running, and they could sit in on that, and it'd be good on a broader level for that. So maybe if we could, I don't know if it'd be a section D, and it would principally focus on conflict of interest. By that point, we may have more detail on those regulations, and Mr. Stewart could include most of the areas that are in 1A of his work plan. Does that make sense to you, Councillor? Okay. Anything further? Okay, the clerk will update the motion based on the discussion, and then I'll look for a mover and a seconder. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Okay, it's on the screen, I believe. I'll look for a mover and a seconder. Okay, any further discussion? Councillor Morgan.
I just want to rush to voting this. I would appreciate, since we have our Integrity Commissioner, Mr. Stewart, here, if he has a chance to read over the motion and ensure that this aligns in our thinking with our discussion that we've had with, as he's heard it, and that this allows him to do the work that he needs to do. It's a good opportunity, he has him here before we pass the motion, to make sure it's all in order. I'm reading through it myself before I vote as well.
Can Mr. Stewart see it on screen or no? Yeah, why don't you just read out particularly C and D, I think.
That the following actions be taken with respect to the annual report of the Integrity Commissioner. A, the annual report of the Integrity Commissioner, as well as the attached written summary of the work plan for the Code of Conduct to be received. B, a summary document outlining the process and requirements for filing a complaint with the Integrity Commissioner, including an appropriate hyperlink, be placed on the City of London's website. C, the Integrity Commissioner be invited to attend a future meeting of the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee in order to provide an education session on the Code of Conduct and other appropriate matters. D, the Integrity Commissioner be directed to report back to the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee at the earliest possible date with an updated Code of Conduct reflecting, amongst other things, the various matters contained in the work plan noted in A above, as well as the forthcoming regulations associated with Bill 68 to the extent they are known. And E, the communication dated August 27, 2017 from B. Brock be referred to the Integrity Commissioner for consideration when reviewing what changes, if any, should be made to the current Code of Conduct.
Councillor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, just for all of our purposes, but mostly for Mr. Stewart, in C, it talks about provide an educational session and at the meeting. And, you know, educational session means different things for different people. And it would be nice for us to be able to advise Mr. Stewart that this is not a classroom type thing where educational session is. So just want to be sure that, I'm not saying that anybody is ignorant, I'm just saying that we need to explain that to others.
I think by session, presentation, Q&A, I think Mr. Stewart will get that. We're not going to the Ivy School of Business for this one, so, okay.
No, I got it.
Does that give you enough context, Mr. Stewart?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. It's been moved and seconded. Can we call that question then?
Motion carries 5-0.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. Great to see you.
Thank you very much for having me.
I hope you got air conditioning for that drive back.
I do.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. We promise it'll be cooler the next time you come in February. Let's turn to our consent items. Committee, what ones would you like pulled? Councillor Park?
Number 6, please.
Number 6.
Number 5.
Number
Has a revision
5.
also.
Number 3.
Number 4?
Number 4. There is something in number 7 that I think we need to pull. Yeah, so sorry, it's actually number 8. My apologies. So number 8 we need to pull. So all we have left is 2, 7, and 9. And I want to make a comment on 2. So we'll put 2, 7, and 9 on the floor. I'll look for a mover and seconder on that. So I'll make that motion. Okay, if I may, just on 2, as Chair of Audit and Chair of Corporate Services, I want to extend my congratulations to our administration, to our city treasurer and all of our finance staff, and quite frankly, to all departments, because it's a collective effort right across the board and keeping things under wrap. This is number 41, ladies and gentlemen, 41. Annalisa is very pleased that it did not break on her first year as city treasurer, but this is number 41 of a AAA, and quite frankly, from an administration point of view, you should be very proud of that. And the report's very clear, and even the cautionary notes are ones that they put on everybody's report. Is just stay the course and keep your controls and places in check. So, Councillor Morgan, further comment on 2, I believe?
Yes, I just wanted to echo what the chair said, and I think that because this has happened, 41, to take this sort of good news report for granted, to put it in context, this means it's been since 1977. I was born in 1978. So we've had a AAA credit rating longer than I've been alive, and longer than a few of us have been alive. Not all of us, though. And I just think it just takes a moment, because so often we have good news financial reports, and it's very easy just to pass them. And so I appreciate the chair taking some time today to provide the context and the importance of the accomplishment, and that it is not an automatic thing, that the assessment is rigorous, it occurs each and every year, and we have to meet significant thresholds to continue to achieve this rating. And not only that, but this credit rating isn't just a fancy number that we can celebrate every 41 years. It leads to substantial savings for the taxpayers of the City of London in the way that we're able to borrow money, and the confidence that they have from the investing of buying cities' debentures and investment vehicles. This rating means Londoners save money, and that's really important to recognize each and every year. So I just wanted to add those comments as well.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Helmer.
I just wonder, I didn't want to pull it because I certainly support the recommendation, but I did wonder if our staff wanted to speak to the intersectionality of race and gender and pay equity. There's a report there, number 9, on page 136. I think that's important. I know it's responding to a council direction to report back on the specific piece, and I wonder through the chair if our staff just want to address that.
Go ahead, Mr. Coxhead.
Thank you. Through the chair, as described here, intersectionality is of race as it relates to gender and equity issues is an area that's not very well understood. At present, there is not legislation or tools or anything that would allow us to really look at it in a comprehensive way. And we've done a look, we've talked with our advisors in this regard, in-house and externally, and you'll see in our conclusions and regarding that it's kind of an academic exercise at present, and hopefully over time we'll understand it better and maybe tools will be employed, but there is no legislation that allows us to look at it in any significant way at this time. That's our research and our desire to report back on that to you.
Councillor Park.
Thank you, and it'll be pretty brief. I just wanted to thank Mr. Coxett in his short stead here as the Human Resources Manager. To have the pay equity report come to us in such a quick manner is quite appreciative. This has been something that I know Council's been waiting on for a period of time, so I just want to thank him and his team for the quick action on it.
Okay. Okay, and thanks for the authors of the report looking to get this up to speed here as well. Could I call a question on the items before us?
Motion carries 5-0.
Okay, we'll go to item number 3, which is where we actually see the AAA rating actually in action in terms of keeping the reins on things. So turn to number 3. Who pulled that? Councillor Morgan?
Yes, and I hope my colleagues will bear with me. I have a number of questions on this, all of which I provided to the treasurer in advance so that she knows that they're coming. Because there's a lot of information in this one, like a lot of information, and it's a pretty important report. It's the mid-year monitoring report on the budget. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to ask a few questions with the committee's indulgence, and I'll make a couple of comments. The first being, I really appreciate the detail in the report. I think that there is a lot of information in here that can lead to some questions, but that it's very important for that process to be transparent. And I think you've done a really good job of providing us the level of detail that allow us to check in on things at a governance level on some of the things that we set directions on a few years ago. The first is a comment, and that's in 2 sections of the report. And I'm going to use the agenda pages, not the report pages, just for my colleagues. On page 14 and 29, there's references to the Back to the River project. And I went back and looked up the actual motion we passed. And so, although a couple of times it says we have to do the EA first, there's also provisions in that motion to say we still have to approve the actual plan. There's going to be information that comes forward. We're going to approve that. And so it just reads a little bit in a couple of sections like it's predetermined. I think we're just certainly moving in that direction, but the motion's pretty clear that we've got a process we're going through. It requires council approval still, and although I agree with the notes in the report, I just wanted to make that as a point. On page 15, the first question I have is, do we have any sense on what the impact is, or the magnitude of the impact that minimum wage increase will have on the City of London?
Question on that, I think outstanding. So Ms. Barbone.
Through the chair, so we've been working together to cost the full impact of this. So within the City of London, we have direct service impacts with respect to minimum wage, primarily in our casual staff. So with those changes, we're anticipating we're well in excess of $1 million, both in 2018 and 2019, with the 2 changes to the $14 and $15. So you will see those coming forward as part of our budget update that will be brought forward to you at the end of October.
Great, thank you. My next question is on page 16. It's under the number 8, the Parks and Urban Forestry. It talks about, do the implementation of the tree protection bylaw in 2016, additional resources will be required. My understanding is the tree protection bylaw, that relates to the debate we had about 75 centimeters, 50 centimeters, what level we're talking. So I just want to clarify again, because at the time of the debate, we were told, and I voted against it because there would be significant financial impacts. In a report that went to PEC recently, it was said, no, this would be absorbed within the current existing budget and there would be no financial impacts. And now I see some potentially high financial impacts. And I just want to clarify is there a financial impact on the tree protection bylaw that we're expecting or not?
Go ahead.
Through the chair. So from our understanding is that they have moved forward with the implementation of the tree protection bylaw, but that they are having challenges meeting within the existing resources based on the reduction in the size of the tree to continue to advance that and also continue through with their work plans for the other areas. So we understand there will be a report that will be brought forward to explain more detail coming forward to the planning committee.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. I'll wait for that report. Page 17, number 11, LMHC, what are we doing to mitigate the issue? So we know that there's a really big number associated with this. There's also kind of a phased-in plan about things that are more immediate, things that are more long-term. Do you have any sense on what level of funding we're talking about to kind of meet the demand and you know, what stuff that we're trying to fix? I mean, I know it's in the report that came forward with the condition of the assets, but I'm unsure on what we're thinking or considering funding.
Through the chair, I have a little bit of information. So based on their last board meeting, I understand they would have submitted a request for 2018 and 2019 for approximately $500,000 each year to get their initial work going and to continue that. We will have the ability to fund from an existing reserve fund. So we're looking at that strategy, and that going forward as part of the multi-year budget, they will be as part of their comprehensive asset management plan, coming forward with the larger long-term plan to support that as part of the multi-year budget. So we don't know what that is yet, but they're in process of working on that.
Great, thank you. That sounds very responsible. Number 14, planning services. This is about Dundas Place. The idea that we're going to need a Dundas Place management office. When we passed the strategic initiatives business case, in the business case it said there's a potential for the Business Improvement Association, I assume they mean the Downtown Business Improvement Association, to play a role in the ongoing operations of this facility. And there was already a $150,000 plan from the operating budget to fund extra materials, cleanups. My understanding at the time that we passed was that maybe that would be run by the downtown BIA. Given that we're now considering a management office, has that changed in some way?
So through the chair, I believe that they're looking at their whole plan and looking at the timing of when things were to occur. So some things were set to go forward later on in the multi-year budget. So they're looking at that assessment of when the timing of those would be appropriate. So right now, even if the BIAs were to do that, they would need some funding to support them through that, is what we understand. So we're looking at those budgets currently, and we'll likely have any potential amendments coming through the multi-year budget, or through our update through them for the multi-year budget.
I'll look to Councillor Park, who sits on that board, that might be able to shed a little bit more light on it.
Yeah, I can say emphatically, there's no desire for downtown London to be the operations manager of Dundas Place going forward in any capacity. They would certainly be good stewards and help any implementation office, but they will not be the implementation office.
Well, given that, and I certainly respect that the downtown BIA needs to focus their priorities where they need to focus. I was simply going by what was in our strategic initiatives business case at the time we passed the budget. And I think this is a good example of one of those times where when we pass a large scale capital investment, we need to associate requisite operating dollars with it in the multi-year budget in an appropriate way. Because it sounds to me like, given the line in this report, we haven't done that adequately. And I just think I'll just make the point that I think we need to do that better at the time of passing the large capital expenditures. And on this, and just confirm my understanding, there have been federal investments or other levels of government who have invested in the capital side of Dundas Place, but we were going to borrow the money for that. So we're not saving any money, we're just offsetting some borrowing.
Ms. Barbeau.
Through the chair, that is correct. It was intended to be financed through debt.
I only have 3 more. On page 24, the $1.6 million to the London Police Services Reserve Fund, is that a normal amount that they would be contributing to the reserve fund? I recall we had some discussions about whether that reserve fund was in a position of sustainability over the medium term, and that it was not. Is this putting them, I mean, this is what they have left over at the end of the year. Is this putting them about where they leave or need to be? And do you know the balance of that reserve fund?
Through the chair, the current balance we understand is approximately $3 million for that. The contribution this year is a little bit higher than what we would traditionally see. That is based on some of the timing with the settlement for the last settlement that did occur and some of the budget transfers that have gone. So there is a bit of a timing difference with respect to when those costs will actually be incurred. So they have an ability this year and possibly next year to be able to put their additional surplus within that reserve fund as part of their budget.
Okay, I appreciate the answer. Two more. On the next page, page 25, there's a line that says that there's lower than anticipated red light camera revenues. And I recall when we discussed the red light cameras, we wanted it to be both self-sustaining from a capital and investment perspective, as well as any additional monies would be put into our road safety strategy. So is the lower anticipated revenues just putting the investment in the road safety strategy at risk, or is it putting us kind of underwater on the initial investment to cover the costs of the red light camera program?
Through the chair. So this is a new program, obviously. So one of the things, just as a reminder, is because of the way we recognize revenue, we do recognize revenue on a cash basis. So there's a bit of a tends with the new program that you have far more expenditures that are incurred up front, and the revenue is a little bit slow to materialize. We've had a little bit of delays initially getting the revenue coming in, but it is starting to flow. So some of this is just a timing and trying to get some experience with the timing of the cash flows and looking at that overall, but the revenue is starting. There's been a bit of a delay with the timing, so it's difficult to have a really solid projection at this point, given it's not been very long, but there may be a little bit of a delay in the first year just as a result of the startup of that program.
Thank you. I really appreciate that clarification. I just, at lower than anticipated red light camera revenues could be misread. Really what you're talking about is kind of a cash flow issue. It's coming in at a little slower pace, but there aren't any dramatic changes in the expectations for that program. The last one is the financial management, probably one of the largest items. Can you just, because for sake of clarity for the public, can you explain what a $3.3 million deficit due to a drawdown in the operating budget contingency reserve that is potentially not required actually means?
Thank you. Through the chair. This one's a little more not so straightforward. So as part of our budget, we have an amount budgeted as a revenue in our operating budgets that essentially is a strategic operating budget contingency draw from the reserve that is essentially a buffer to kind of offset unexpected events or anticipated events during the year. So based on our anticipated projection for the end of this year, we're not anticipating that we're going to require it and require that draw from our draw from the reserve fund at this time. However, there's still 6 months left in the year, and there could be changes, but that's what that is we're not needing to do that to offset significant unexpected events that did not occur.
Great, that sounds like a good news story. And I just wanted to wrap up by saying thank you very much for answering all of my questions today. I do very much appreciate the level of detail in the report, and I appreciate that my colleagues allowed me to take the time to go through some of the questions. I think it's important, particularly on the mid-year monitoring report for our budget, that we do some check-in on this. I look forward to any comments my colleagues have as well.
Others? I have one question. My question's on page 16, and it pertains to the municipal election. We were waiting to see what it was going to cost us for the ranked ballot. We were all excited about ranked ballot, at least some were. So have we got any further clarity on what it's going to cost us to roll this out?
Through Mr. Chair, we are closer. We do have a vendor, and we'll be reporting out on the cost with respect to the vendors shortly within the next month or so. So we are getting closer, yes.
So if we put an RFP out, and what's shortly?
We did an RFQ, and we have had a demonstration given to us by one of the vendors. We will be recommending a single source. So we should be reporting out within the next month.
All right. Councillor Helmer, on item number
3.
3.
Yeah. First of all, I'm glad to see that we have a surplus. You know, it's great. Hopefully we end up in a similar position at the end of the year. For the monies that are being returned to the reserve funds from the operating budget, you know, if that's where we think we are authorizing a number of returns back to the reserve funds with this motion, are we taking a look at the sort of, some of these reserve funds are our annual contributions in the multi-year budget? And when we have, you know, if we're consistently returning reserves back to those reserve funds, that we're keeping an eye on the level of those reserve funds, and do we really need to have the level of contributions that we have budgeted? I just wonder if our staff could speak to that and how this process here feeds into any amendments that might happen on the reserve fund side.
Through the chair. So right now, this gives us a bit of an opportunity to return stuff back. What we can say is we are currently looking and doing a thorough evaluation of all our reserve funds and comparing them against what our potential commitments are. What I can tell you is that we haven't been able to quite get to the point where we have targets available, but we certainly, based on the commitments, have a long ways to get to go. So this certainly is helping us maintain our current levels. We are hoping by the end of the year we'll be close enough to have a little bit better idea of where we're going to be as to how we want to do that. Certainly as part of our budget review right now, we have gone through everything. We're not suggesting that there needs to be significant changes. We think we're okay for the most part, but we're continually looking through that. And I think as we move forward to getting some updated policies with respect to our targets and where we want to be, particularly with respect to our infrastructure gap and how we're getting there, we still have a long ways to go, but we're inching whatever this will help us get there a little bit quicker. So I don't anticipate we're going to be above our targets on a lot of them. I think we still have, but I think we're certainly through our Moody's credit rating, again, this year shows us that we're headed in the right direction, and our continued diligence and moving forward is getting there slowly.
Okay. I'll take a motion on this item. And I'll call it if there's no further discussion.
Motion carries 5-0.
Okay, we'll turn to item number 4, which is sort of the similar drill on capital, except for on our mid-year capital monitoring. Thanks for coming. Questions? Who pulled this? Councillor Helmer.
Okay, so very similar question. I'll start with that. For the capital side, again, we're returning something in the neighborhood of $4.8 million back to reserves. And I'll just let you answer it for the capital side. It may be the exact same answer, in which case just say ditto or something.
Through the chair, I want to say ditto. It's very similar, and I think with respect to this, if anything, it is helping mitigate some of potential draws as we go forward, and I think that's where if we start to see cost overruns and things like that, there is a source that's been preserved to help support capital budget in the future and potentially mitigate any increases in the levy to support it.
Okay, I wanted to comment on Appendix B. So I think we're starting to get to very detailed answers about, you know, what's going on in each one of these accounts and when we expect them to actually be closed out. And I think this is an area where we've just seen continual improvement in terms of the reporting. It really allows myself, and I'm sure my colleagues, when we look at the expected completion date column, for example, to get a sense of when these things will be wrapped up, when we might expect to see them come out in the year-end the year-end monitoring reports. And also a way to look back to say, okay, if I see this account on here again and it said it was going to be closed out in Q4 2017, some sense that, you know, maybe something's going sideways on that. So I think that this is becoming a very, very useful report. I just wanted to say that to our staff and finance. It's great.
Okay, I have a couple things, if I may, from the chair. Just on page 34, the demolition of 280 York and 340 Wellington, it's over budget. So we'll be reevaluating that. Is that what we're saying? It's over 50,000 more. So where does that go from here?
Through the chair, that one specifically, I believe we are about to go out to tender, so we don't have a confirmed cost, but that is what we're anticipating the potential cost to be. So when the tender comes back, we'll have some certainty on the cost for that.
So I guess there's kind of, when you send something out for tender and you say that it's going to be over 50,000 over budget, doesn't that send a kind of, yeah, don't worry about what your tender costs are going to be except for beat the other guy. But does that not somehow send a signal to the market?
Through the chair, we've done some extensive evaluation to get a sense of what we believe the projected cost is going to be, and based on, we're hoping it does not come in excess of this at this time. So there is some designated substances there that were higher than what we had originally anticipated, so we know the cost will be higher than what it was initially.
And just further, since I have a convention center board meeting on Thursday morning, and if we don't have the full answer for this, perhaps Mr. Hayward could be briefed on it so he could bring that to the board or the mayor. This is just the knockdown demolition costs. This has nothing to do with redevelopment of that space.
Through the chair, that's correct.
So we're left with basically a vacant site on one of our primary gateways.
It does include some very basic, getting it to look, it is not anything overextensive to make it beyond what we would want to have as a minimal standard in that area.
Okay, thank you very much. The other thing I wanted to ask, and just for committee's appreciation, is just, and I'm sure some of them have had similar situations where projects have gone out to tender and we've had to withdraw, withdraw it because it's come back excessively exceeding our budget. And can you give us just a little bit of an update on some of the trends that we're seeing on a go-forward basis and what the implications that they may have?
Through the chair, I think overall what we're starting to see is a general inflationary pressure for tenders that are coming back with respect to specifically subtrade costs for some of the larger projects. We believe we're trying right now to try to understand, and some of it we're at a bit of a loss to understand exactly what is causing, but we're certainly seeing some very specific cost overruns across some of our projects, and that's in a general sense across all of our projects. So a lot of it is demand, particularly to try to get the trades in to provide the work. We are seeing some inflationary components with the cost of some mechanical equipment as well. So certainly in terms of going forward, particularly as we monitor our capital projects and particularly as we look at our budget updates, is we need to take a very close look at what the costs are included as our capital costs projected for our capital budget to ensure that in the future that we can either find ways to mitigate them or to look at how we might, to ensure we have the right budget in place to be able to support the projects.
That to me is, beyond the nuts and bolts of each particular project, is one of those looming trends that could have a significant impact both on a budget update, but certainly our 5 and 10 year capital projections and going into our next 5-year budget plan. Of course, we have a rolling 5 and 10 year on capital, but I think that's something that we have to figure out. And I'd like to know, and I don't, think that we need to be seeing how we're comparing with other municipalities, what the private sector construction industry is experiencing. You know, how much of it is what I call 300 Dufferin inflation. So when it's a government related public sector, there's a premium, whether that's, and what's causing some of that. I'm not sure. I'm not saying it is that. I'm just saying we need to be aware of that and see how we're comparing across other municipalities, because they'd be under the similar pressures with the similar skill shortfalls and all of those sorts of things. So thank you very much, and I'll take a motion on this if there's no other. Is there, Councillor?
It's very quick and kind of petty, I'm sorry. On 34, the project on 340 Wellington Road, before I get in a turf war, if it's downtown, it's street. So we don't alarm the folks down at Baseline that we might be doing work down there that we're not doing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a mover and a seconder. Call the question. I'm sorry, Jesse.
I just wanted to just confirm with our staff, I know we already dealt with 3, but, so with 3, we had $6.8 million in surplus between the different tax supported and the rate supported, the water, wastewater. And then in the capital, we had $7.1 million capital surplus, so it's being returned as we close out those projects. So $6.8 million surplus and then $7.1 million surplus. So that seems pretty great, and I just don't want us to miss that.
It is good, and this is financial prudence, both from finance department, but it's also the hard work of everyone down the line, holding the line, so to speak, on costs and trying to get the best value. So thank you. Okay.
Motion carries 5-0.
We'll move on to item number 5 on telepathy.
We have the new recommendation.
I'm sorry.
That's one with revised recommendation.
Yeah. So if you're telepathic, you'll already know what the vote's going to be. Work with me a little bit, eh? It's a dad joke. All right. There's a revised recommendation on this one, which is on your screen now. It was on your blotter. Any questions or comments on this one, Councillor Usher?
Not on the revised recommendation. I just have a simple question, and maybe Mr. Daly might be able to answer it. But these 1,800, what do we call them, desk phones, etc., do they include councillors' phones also? Because I remember some time ago, we separated councillors' equipment from the rest of the corporation. I just want to, it's really negligible, but can you tell me whether or not it is? And if it's not, will it be incorporated in a contract somehow?
Thank you, and through the chair, the desk phones in the councillor's office are included in the contract that you see before you today. Thank you.
So do we have a separate PBX? I believe that we, councillors, have a separate system from the rest of the corporation, do we not? And is that dependent on a PBX?
No, so the way in which we have architected that solution is that councillors have a separate data network. So you guys have a segregated data network for your dealings through to the internet, whereas the corporation has a separate data network. When it comes to the use of these phones, it follows the corporate network on as it's related to the private branch exchange. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
This is the revised recommendation, right? Okay, thank you.
Motion carries 5-0.
Very much. We'll turn to item number 6, which I believe Councillor Park, you pulled.
Thank you. I think this report is quite good, and it's also quite timely with next year quickly approaching. I did have a question. So on page 111, under the Appendix A1, with the definitions, city shall mean yada yada, and city resources shall mean facilities, equipment, property, supplies, etc. So if at this point in time, any counselor is using a software like Nation Builder or MailChimp and that sort of thing for their constituency work, what kind of safety regulations do we have in place to make sure that that information that's gathered from the constituency side does not make its way to the election side? So I wonder if the clerk could speak to that.
Madam Clerk?
Through Mr. Chair, any information that is gathered by a councillor as part of their role as a council member should not be then transferred and utilized for campaign purposes, because that's not the purpose for which it was collected. Similar when during a campaign, when a candidate has a voters list, they're not after the election to use that for any purpose, because that's why it was provided for.
So if there are some members of council at this time who are utilizing those tools, how do we maintain that that doesn't actually get into the campaign side of it? I haven't quite heard that bit yet. Because the incumbent advantage in that is just huge, and it's to the detriment of anybody outside of council right now trying to seek election.
If we received a complaint or information that a member of council was utilizing corporate resources for their campaign period, then we would contact that councillor and show them the use of corporate resources policy that was passed by council.
And this is just food for thought going forward with any new council coming into fore. There should probably be a process where on the constituency side, perhaps it's the administration staff in our office that has the logins and that sort of thing, so that the corporation of the City of London owns those lists, because it can very easily move over. Like an Excel spreadsheet, you can make those anywhere. It's a matter of how do we make sure that the constituency side, and there's a firewall between that and the election side going forward. So I appreciate the comments of the clerk, but I think it's something we should all be mindful of.
I think certainly also the other part of it is the cost of the subscription. You know, if you're using a MailChimp or whatnot, can't be paid for during the campaign period out of municipal expenses, so. Okay. Anything else on that, Councillor Morgan?
Yes, in this particular report, I noticed that although many things change with the change in election dates, particularly to, I think it's May 1st now is when someone can start filing, and it's end of July when the nomination day is. So one end kind of moves down, the other end backs up. I noticed in this report, they're keeping January 1st as the election period, as the definition of the election period, which is not true. The election period is the shortened period that the ministry has defined under the Municipal Act. So I wonder if, you know, we should correct that to line up with the election period, because this policy is in effect since January 1st, and I wonder if colleagues feel it should be in effect from May 1st, because we're defining election period as something that it is not.
I think there's a question there, and I think the clerk has an answer to that because it was done not accidentally but deliberately. Clerk?
Through Mr. Chair, that's correct. My recommendation to council is that it should be January 1st. The concern that we have is that a member of council has access to those corporate resources between January 1st and May 1st, whereas someone outside that is an outside candidate wouldn't have that same benefit. So to ensure that there's an even playing field, we're recommending that it be January 1st.
Councillor Morgan, of course, it's at the discretion of council what you want to do, so.
Yeah, so I'm respectful of the clerk's recommendation. My question on this is more that I feel like the January 1st date feels relatively arbitrary to me, and that we're actually defining an election period that is not the election period. And if, given the logic that was just explained, I mean, why not a year from the election then? Why not December 25th? Why not January 7th? I mean, January 1st is an arbitrary start to the calendar year. It means nothing in the legislation from an election standpoint. So I just don't understand that date. And if that date is going to stand, then I do have some questions on the impacts of things like item 5, which says no council member shall distribute in print or electronic material paid for by the city that illustrates, references, promotes, profiles, otherwise relays information about an individual who's a registered candidate or expects to be blah, blah, blah. So if I have a ward meeting planned in spring of 2018 and we're defining the election period as January 1st and I can't print or put in electronic, basically I can't promote a ward meeting. I'm just not sure of the implications of this. I want to make sure that I understand what we're passing and that there's no unintended consequences of us being able to do our duty, because I know 6.2 says nothing in this policy is intended to prohibit a member of council from performing their job. I don't want to do anything that's inappropriate. Absolutely not. I think I've been fairly clear on that all the way through my term. But I don't want to not be able to do my job or feel criticism because I can't do something that is a component of the job of a counselor. I think as we get close to if I file as a candidate, yeah, absolutely, I feel that there should be lots of restrictions on what I can and can't do. But up until that point, it feels a little bit arbitrary to have this January 1st deadline, given the extent of what the extent of the way the restrictions could be interpreted.
If we can get an answer, clerk.
Through Mr. Chair, Section 5 is not intended to prohibit a councillor from using city resources. You know, if you're having a ward meeting, to send out a flyer indicating you're having a ward meeting. The interpretation of that section is if you're sending out some material that is promoting you as a candidate, it's indicating that you will be running, or that promoting things that happened in the past that might promote you as a potential candidate. But certainly if you're having a ward meeting that is talking about things that are currently before council that you will be discussing, there's nothing in this policy that would prohibit you from using city resources to promote that ward meeting.
Well, I like that interpretation. I just don't read it quite the same way. And my concern is that I see that's the way the clerk reads it. I hear that's what we're interpreting. If I were a member of the public and I saw someone having a ward meeting and I read this literally, I'd say, well, it's not minutes of city council and it's not minutes of standing committee. So how are you mailing me out a notice on this ward meeting? It's just, I think we need to be really clear. If we're gonna create this arbitrary January 1st date, then let's make sure we're not restricting, you know, the ability to do the job for almost a quarter of the term.
Through Mr. Chair, Section 5 also outlines that material restriction is where it illustrates, references, promotes, profiles, or otherwise relays information about an individual that is or will be registered as a candidate in the election. So my interpretation of that is you can't use it for something that is suggesting or promoting you as a candidate. We can go back and look at 5 and see if there's some clear wording we could bring forward before council that might make the councillor feel more comfortable, but that certainly wasn't our intent, to prohibit someone from using city resources to do their normal work as a councillor.
Well, I looked to my committee colleagues to clarify. I would appreciate some clarification there, not because I don't 100% accept your interpretation of it, but because I can see how that being read literally could be misinterpreted, and then lots of complaints and people misinterpreting what is allowed and isn't allowed. And I think clarity on something like this is very important. And I also don't know if my colleagues want to weigh in on my comments on the January 1st. I'm certainly not going to try to make a change if no one's supportive of it.
Councillor Park.
Thank you. I think there's merit in the January 1 beginning, because I think, like I said a few moments ago, incumbents have a huge advantage, and the longer that we can take advantage of that advantage, the worse off it is for individuals outside of council trying to seek a seat. In terms of the mailings and that sort of thing, I think we can certainly advertise Ward 13 or Ward 7 and that sort of thing, but the second we attach a name to it, it has a whole nother connotation to it.
Yeah, I'll go to you first, Councillor Helmer. Go ahead.
So I'll just give an example of where I think under 5, you can run into some things I don't think we're trying to prohibit, but probably are if you read it really strictly. So under 2, city resources includes an example, print or electronic materials paid for by the city promoting a member of council. Later on in 5, it talks about promoting or profiling. And if you were just to look at our ward pages, a lot of the ward pages have language in them that frankly is profiling the councillor. And if I were to just tweet, like distribute an electronic form, I'm just going to tweet a link to this ward page that's about one of my colleagues and say, this person's running, they're great. Now, like, I'm probably in contravention of this policy because it's a city paid for resource. But I mean, obviously that's not really a problem, right? I don't know if that's actually a problem, that I tweeted a link to a page that's been up for years. That has the person's contact information. And so, I think some of those pieces, mine just says I'm the counselor for Ward 4, by the way, so I don't have this problem. But, I think that's where we can run into some issues because the language is a little, it's very broad and it covers a lot of things. And I think we want to be very clear that you can't use, especially city money and city staff to do things in the election. That's very clear. But I think we don't want to be so broad that, we can't talk about people who are running in the election or, tweet about things and link to pages that have been up for a long time. So I'm not sure how to change that or fix it. I think it's okay the way it is now. If it was slightly more specific language, I think how it's interpreted is more important than, the exact words that are on this page. But I did want to just give it as an example because I think it's a bit tricky.
Thank you very much. It's an interesting discussion. I think I appreciate Councillor Morgan's perspective about the timing there. It was said our goal in this is to level the playing field. I don't think you need a level playing field until the game starts. And so that might be the nomination time. Regarding it, if we can't profile and talk about these things as of January 1st, could we do it before then? Would that be appropriate? I don't think it would be appropriate either. So we might be fine with that later timing as far as the nomination goes. I know when I was looking at this, I was a little concerned because there's a number of issues. I want to send out certainly a newsletter. There's a newsletter I wanted to send out describing the completion of a number of projects for Ward 1, but they've been delayed. So it's going to be, and we're still, for instance, the CIP, I guess we're expecting in November. I thought it was going to come May, but November we're going to get a report. But I'll want to report out on that in some probably printed format to the people around the neighborhood because they need to know what new programs are going to be available to them, et cetera, et cetera. And I hope that wouldn't fall into this category where all of a sudden I'm receiving criticism for doing the job. And I think that's the problem is, are we going to be criticized or challenged for just doing the job?
Madam Clerk, do you want to add anything? No? Okay. I think the point's well taken, Councillor Usher.
Well, I don't want to elaborate too much on this, but I think that I need to say a few words because I think that the big thing here is that this is happening because of the change from January the 1st election period. And I agree with Councillor Morgan that we want to do the job, but we don't want it to seem as though we are trying to promote ourselves. So you get January the 1st, and I quite respect and appreciate where the clerk is coming from with that. But if somebody in March, we are still here until the end of next year at least. And if somebody at the end of March needs to hold, let's say, a public meeting, and they need to advertise this meeting, and they want their constituents to come, is that going to be promotion? It may not sound so from what the clerk is saying, but the public out there is going to say we're using city's resources to promote ourselves, and that would be a concern of mine. I don't want to hold myself back if I want to hold a public meeting in March, but somebody out there will say that we are doing that. So how do you conquer that?
Madam Clerk.
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure if this will assist or not, but there are other provisions under the Municipal Elections Act that restrict and prohibit people from campaigning outside of the campaign period. So there's another section that will clearly indicate what you can and cannot do prior to May 1st, for sure. So I think this policy plus that provision in the act will help to clarify what can and cannot be done between January 1st and May 1st.
Thank you. If I may comment, you know, in my perspective over the last 3 elections, I remember in 2010 watching, in the run-up to the 2010, watching some members of council, none of whom are here. And it was clearly, the intent was clearly a violent, like they were clearly using corporate, their expense accounts, and it was the intent of it. And I think if all of a sudden, if you've never held a ward meeting, and all of a sudden you're having a ward meeting, you know, in March of 2018, and you've never had one ever before, and in March of 2018, you've never had a website before, and now you have a website, you've never done a mailing, it's clear what you are doing. And to the tremendous credit of all members of council currently sitting here, this council has done more work in terms of ward meetings, constituent communications, engagement across than any of the 3 councils I've been a part of before, and to all of your credit, frankly. I know that when I was first elected in the 4th year, which was the election year, I always had a ward meeting. And in the election year, I did not have a ward meeting because it was clearly, we were in that election period. So I think what it does is it highlights the need for us to be vigilant, to maintain our integrity, to maintain the transparency, and gives a little bit of guidance to that. Now, colleagues, if you'd like the clerk to sort of, and Ms. Westlake Power to sort of hear our commentary and maybe think a little bit if there's some clarity that could be brought, particularly in that 5th section before council, we could certainly give them direction to do that. But frankly, before this, I don't think they had the tools at all in which to say to someone, you know what, you're really offside here, and we're trying to give them the tools. And yet, to be perfectly honest, I think this group, I don't have a whole lot of concern about this group of counselors, but we make policy based on any group of counselors in the future as well. So if you'd like to give direction to staff to give some further consideration and to think if there's some clarification that could be brought to, I'm sure they could do that prior to council. Or if you're happy with the explanation, we can just move it forward now. I'll look for a motion. Councillor Park? Councillor Park's moving it. Is there a seconder? Councillor Helmer, you indicated, did you want to speak further? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I think Councillor Morgan may be onto something with the May 1. I was just taking a look at the legislation, and Section 8818 requires the municipalities and school boards to have their rules in place around resources before May 1. So, you know, I think that there's a general idea even within the legislation that, you know, the campaign period starts May 1, and that's what the rules are going to be. You need to have them in place by that date because that's when they really matter, is during the campaign period. Certainly, candidates are not able to spend any money, or, you know, they can't incur any expenses before they're candidates, and I think that's a broader piece that prohibits all of these things anyway. So I do think that there's something to be said for starting on May 1. I'm going to think about it between now and council and see if that's really worth changing. I also think that none of these things, as Councillor Van Holst was talking about, I don't think they should be happening in advance of the election either. You know, if you're spending money to promote yourself and you're using city resources to do that, I don't think that's a great idea either. So I also am fine with the way it is now with January. So I'm just going to think about that between now and council.
Councillor Morgan.
Yeah, just so I can be clear, and I'm glad Councillor Hummer said what he said, because that's the way I'm feeling exactly, is most of the circumstances that the clerk had described as not being allowed, I'm pretty sure are prohibited under the pre-campaigning rules in the Act anyways. And I know that we should have additional restrictions, and those are, in my opinion, those restrictions should happen during the election period. If we're gonna define the election period as something different than what the ministry is defining it, I just wanted to have a really good reason for that. Because to me, January 1st could be, you know, October 27th of the year before. It could be actually an election year if we wanted to do it that way. I just don't see a reason for that date. I also recognize what Councillor Helmer said, there's probably not a lot of impact on whatever date it is. I just get a little fussy over the policy making sometimes and making sure the dates make sense to me. So I'll do the same as Councillor Helmer. I'll think about it up till council, and maybe when we get the clarification on 5, we can have a little more information on the justification and rationale for the January 1st date to make us comfortable with why that date as opposed to any other date in the calendar year that isn't the nomination day.
Okay. Clerk, do you need any further direction to review the 5? You'll just take it as, okay. So we'll call the question, and maybe we'll see where we end up on the, I'm sure we'll have an interesting debate at council on the 1st versus the 1st of May, 1st of January versus 1st of May. Call the question.
Motion carries 5-0.
Okay, folks, we have one further item, item number 8, which I pulled. And the reason I pulled it is there is a item you'll see in the recommendation. Trends are healthy. We're headed in the right direction. Things are good. We've had this report, and you can see that staff give us a 7-year, actually a 10-year trending. Mr. Coxhead has suggested in the second sentence of the recommendation that they move to an annual review versus a 6-month review. Some of the trends are, 6 months is a pretty short period of time on some of these things, and we've really worked hard on this over the last decade, and that annual may be adequate. Do you want to add anything, Mr. Coxhead?
Thank you. Through the chair, yes, I think we've done a lot of work over a decade, and there was a need for regular monitoring early on in the program. The report's very thorough with respect to our practices that seem to be working to get folks back to work in a safe and reasonable way as quickly as possible, whenever that's possible. So we would prefer to spend our time working on other things than biannual reports.
Any discussion? I'll take a mover and a seconder, and then Councillor Helmer.
Yeah, I think it's quite reasonable. I think, the years we've been reviewing these reports, certainly it's been quite stable, and I think that if anything, the trends are going in a positive direction. And, I know this is something that's monitored closely at the staff level. It's not as though no one's paying attention to what's going on with these things. The question is how often is it going to come to committee and council, and I think switching to yearly is very reasonable.
Okay. Go seconder. Call the question.
Carries 5-0.
Okay, folks, that's all I have for public session. Could I have a motion to go in camera? Councillor Usher, seconded by Councillor Helmer. We will go across the hall. We will adjourn from across the hall as well.
If you could ask members to
And members, would you please shut down, log off your computers, please?